Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the MLS Hour. This session will cover the new 2021 MLS policies and model rules that went into effect January 1 and are required for local adoption by March 1st. Joining me today is Rodney Gancho, Director of Engagement, and Charlie Lee, Senior Counsel here at NAR. So as we go through, please feel free to send in your questions through the Q&A function. We'll answer your questions as we go through the webinar. If it's something that we'll touch on later or not related to the content that we're currently on, we'll hold your question towards the end, but we'll make sure that we get to those as well. All right, so going to jump into it. The way we've set up the presentation is how you'll see the information appear in the summary document. I've sent that through the chat. You can find that posted on our website as well. If you go to nar.realtor and search for MLS policy, you'll find a link to the 2021 summary of the changes along with the updated 2021 MLS policy handbook. So I've set that up here. First, we'll cover the changes to the model MLS rules, and we'll identify as we go as well the changes to the MLS policies themselves and identify what changes you need to adopt locally. All right, so first one up. This is a new model rule, section 1.2.0. It's mandatory and it's dealing with accuracy of listing information. Participants and subscribers are required to submit accurate listing data and are required to correct any known errors. Rodney, can you give us an overview of the intent behind this policy and what's the genesis of us getting to this policy here, or this model rule?
Yeah, thank you very much, Renee. And thanks everybody for joining us today to go over the 2021 changes in policy. A number of the policy changes for this year stem from the MLS Standards Work Group. That work group is still in existence, started continuing their work again just yesterday. The goal of that group is to create a list of MLS standards, what all participants and subscribers should expect when they join a multiple listing service. They worked extensively over the summer and fall of last year, hoping to finalize their work for the November meetings. Once they got into it more, they realized it was bigger than what they intended, and they broke up their work into two phases. Phase one was the adoption of a number of policy changes, standalone policy changes, in and of themselves, not standards for MLSs, but things that the group discovered through their discussions as needed changes in policy. And the one thing that this group did through their deliberations was they really tried to narrow it down as to who were the key stakeholders in the industry and what were their needs and how were those needs satisfied by multiple listing services. And this will come as no shock to anybody on this webinar, but it boils down primarily to data. That the most important thing that the MLS does and provides to the various stakeholders in the industry is providing the most accurate and the most complete data. So you'll see a theme through a number of these policies and these rules, this one in particular, that talks about creating accurate information and complete information. And this one drives right to the heart of the issue in that there wasn't a policy on the books on a national level before that stated this, but now MLSs can adopt, or MLSs will adopt this policy, which will require participants to provide accurate information, and where it's deemed that the information is not accurate, that they will correct that. And that benefits obviously the participants who use that information, the appraisers, everybody else in our ecosystem, and ultimately best serves the consumers that the brokers interact with. So that's in a nutshell where this came from, what the underlying theme of it is. And like I said, you'll see that same theme peppered through a lot of our discussion today.
Great, thank you for that, Rodney. Charlie, there's often a consideration that needs to be taken into account of liability and what information is presented to the MLS, right? So it's, when we talk about accuracy of listing information, there's some easy ones, right? If the home is located in any town USA, but you say it's located in the Western Pacific, that's clearly not accurate. But there's some real world examples that we come across, right? A listing broker goes out, they pull a property profile from tax records, they see that on tax records, it's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,000 square feet home. But when they show up to the listing appointment, it's 4-bedroom, 2-bath, so it's got an additional bedroom and 500 additional square feet. And the question comes up, well, is it permitted? Is it not? Does a broker have a duty to investigate that further? But for purposes of this rule, when we focus on what's accurate to report to the MLS, what sort of considerations should the brokers take into account and the MLSs themselves of what information they're capturing?
Yeah, thanks, Renee. I think, in trying to judge what is accurate, here we're going to look to the professional judgment of the broker as to ensure that the information and the representation that's being made is not misleading or is not false. It kind of goes to Article 12, where you want to paint and represent a true and accurate picture of the property, representations of the property. And I think in terms of the process of uploading or inputting this type of information, that is going to involve what the client tells you. It is also going to have to involve double checking that information. And sometimes there's discrepancy between what the tax records show or what the government records show. And the broker should really perform due diligence. And when the information is then put into the MLS, that they can be confident that they have done their job so that they cannot be accused of, misleading a client in, submitting an offer on their property where it does not accurately match what they believe the property to be. And I will say that in terms of just, the liability concerns, these things happen often. Just kind of in, my experience, I've worked with an appraisal organization, and I will tell you that it is a common claim where appraisers get sued because, the client will say, well, the square footage was off by, a couple of feet, or, they will say that maybe it was zoned right. And I will say that from the appraiser's perspective, they will say that, well, the client is the bank or is the lender. And that's where they will try to, they will get out of the liability. And so then it kind of falls down the line, and then people will look to the broker. And so I think this rule here really just kind of reinforces and ensures that brokers are, one, serving their client's best interest. They are serving the public's interest. They're ensuring that the cooperating broker isn't going to be stuck in a situation where they're being accused of relying on, bad information. And then it also protects, the MLS and the brokers as well.
Great, thank you for that, Charlie. And Rodney, if I can back up for a minute, and just to further explain, we're covering this in 2 sections, right? Updated or new model MLS rules and updated or new MLS policies. Can you touch on the distinction between the two and how those are incorporated by MLSs locally, in particular the ones that are marked mandatory with the red M here on the screen?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Renee. The handbook, and this parallels what's reflected in the Handbook on Multiple Listing Policy, which last was revised in 2005. And I think we have aspirations at some point here to go in there and maybe look at the structure of that, and if there's a better way to do it, exploring that more. But as it exists today, the first part of the handbook is what's referred to as the MLS Policy Statements. These are foundational issues, considerations that MLSs need to follow, or there's direction and guidance. You'll see the coding as explained in the beginning of the handbook. The M means mandatory. It means all MLSs have to abide by those policies in order to receive errors and omissions insurance coverage from the National Association. There's also informational policies that are there to help provide direction and guidance. And there's recommended ones where it's not mandatory, but NAR and through its governance process has determined that we believe all MLSs should do this. And I can't recall off the top of my head if there's another one. I think there might be another one, optional. There's an optional one in there too, an O, where it's completely at the discretion of the MLS whether it wants to adopt that or not. So the first part of the handbook, again, are the policy statements, the foundational policies that MLSs have to follow. And then the second half of the handbook are the model governing documents created by the National Association that local MLSs can utilize to create their own rules and regulations and their own model MLS, or they're not model, but their own MLS bylaws for the governance of their services. When it comes to bylaws, state law may dictate what's in your bylaws, what isn't in your bylaws, so those can vary greatly. When it comes to the rules and regulations, a lot of MLSs will adopt verbatim the NAR model rules and regulations because it's the best way to ensure that you're meeting the mandatory elements of the policies that are adopted by the National Association. Some entities like the California Association have their own model MLS governing documents that they provide for their MLSs in their state. That model is substantially consistent with the provisions in the NAR model rules and regulations. But these documents are there to assist MLSs, to assist leadership, staff in ensuring that they understand and they incorporate the mandatory policies and rules in local governing documents.
Great, thank you for that, Rodney. There was, before we move on to the next section, there's a question from Margaret. She asks, I'm sorry, Colin, and then there's followed by Margaret. But Colin asks, for MLSs that lock fields from editing, once a listing is live, must they unlock those fields for editing by listing side, or is staff only being able to make the correction still okay if staff is notified or directed to make the correction? So NAR doesn't have any policies or rules requiring or mandating local business rules. So how you set up your platform, what you require, what fields you lock, if you will. That's a local decision. I think what we would suggest is reviewing maybe common errors that occur or fields that could potentially change, information within those fields that could potentially change during a transaction. As an example, I would imagine most of you allow editing of the price field. And that makes sense, right? A price could change up or down during the life cycle of the transaction. But there are other fields that might make sense to lock and prevent user editing during a transaction. Those are business decisions or business rules made locally, but we would encourage you to take a look at those fields that maybe contain information that should be updated or can be updated during the life cycle of a listing, and have those discussions with your leadership locally to identify which fields maybe should allow for editing or which fields should be escalated to staff. The point here is ensuring that accurate listing data is captured, and if any inaccuracies are identified, that they're corrected timely. So I would look at those there.
And you want me to tackle Margaret's question?
If you would, please. Thank you.
Yeah. So Margaret asked the question, will the MLS users be required to leave listing photos so that accuracy is good for future appraisers and BPO completion? In their market, they have high-end homes where the realtors are pulling all but one of the photos. So this provision doesn't speak to that. The applicability of a photo would be if it was an incorrect photo. So if there was an incorrect photo and that was brought to the MLS's attention, they could tell the participant and request that the participant change that photo to an accurate photo of the property. But this doesn't get into whether a decision is made to retain the photos of a property for historical purposes or to pull that information.
Great, thank you, Rodney. And Joseph has a question that relates to photographs as well. And that's whether photographs and the accuracy of them, so what they're portraying, is to be considered listing data in terms of this policy. I'll start that one off by saying, generally, so factor in code of ethics considerations as well, and you'll see some crossover into state license regulation, state license law. If we're talking about representation of a listing or content of a listing, you also have to balance that with ensuring that members aren't misrepresenting. So if a photograph is manipulated, for example, to show that there's structural modifications that can be portrayed in a photograph that don't exist at the property, and there's a representation that is what the property looks like, that would be a misrepresentation. There's code of ethics concerns there. Rodney or Charlie, do you see that? How do you see that playing with this new model rule requiring accuracy of listing data, where a photograph is potentially misrepresenting either the property itself or a feature of the property, or and one instance that I dealt with, for example, was removing a power line that came down to the property. Photograph may have been removed, may have been altered to remove that power line coming to the property.
Okay. Yeah,
No,
sorry,
go ahead,
Rodney,
Jim.
did you want to go?
No, go ahead. I'll go after you.
Okay. I think that, the same principle would apply for photographs as well, in that you want to make sure that the photograph most accurately represents, the property, and that consumers, potential buyers are not misled in any way about, the condition or the state or what the property is. I kind of go back to a scenario that I came across where someone had a asphalt driveway, and then they photoshopped the photograph so that it didn't look like it was asphalt, or maybe it was gravel driveway, and then they made it look like it was asphalt. Sorry. So, and then there was I believe, a lawsuit that was threatened or filed in that case. And so I think in that scenario that you want to make sure that the photographs also properly and accurately represent the property itself.
And as far as changes to photos and whether that's a violation of the code or not, that's a philosophical conversation we've had in the past at the MLS forum. There's no hard and fast line with regard to that. Some of the considerations you'll have is the extent of those changes in the photo, if there's substantive changes, and the number of changes to a photo. There's a line in there somewhere where someone might create a misrepresentation, but policy doesn't completely draw what that is or isn't. Article 12, creating a true picture, is the standard that would be used, and realtors should be careful of. Somebody asked that they weren't following, do they have to leave photos or not? This policy does not require that they leave photos into the multiple listing service.
Thank you for that, Rodney. Thank you, Charlie. See, there are a number of other questions. We'll get to those as we go through. We're going to get into a couple of different areas, but please continue to send in your questions, and we'll circle back and address those that are related to accuracy as we go through the session here. Oops. Let's go the other way here. Okay, the next model rule is an existing model rule that has added a note to it. So this is section 7, addresses compliance with the rules and authority to discipline. And you have the text of the addition here of note 2, and it's underlined. That signifies an update or addition to existing model rule. And this is addressing the number of administrative sanctions that a participant or subscriber can receive in a calendar year. Rodney, can you touch on the background of this one, and how, once this is adopted, what's envisioned with the addition of this to the model rules?
Yes, thanks, Renee. So this is another one that came out of the work group. And there was a determination by that group made that for a lot of brokers, not a lot, but for some brokers, there is a approach of violating certain rules as just a cost of doing business. And they would pay administrative sanctions without concern. Some MLSs have already addressed this locally by incorporating certain limitations on the number of administrative sanctions that can be issued. This would establish a national standard where you can have no more than 3 administrative sanctions in a calendar year before any subsequent potential violation brought to the MLS would have to go before a hearing. There's one exception to this, and the exception is if it deals with issues related to listing information provided by a participant or subscriber, that the MLS can still have that 3 administrative sanction if they choose to. But if they see those type of errors or misinformation as being more incidental or accidental, that they can expand that 3 administrative sanctions to something more when you talk about listing information provided to the MLS. Whatever position you take there at the local level, you should do it consistently. not on a case-by-case basis, but look at what you want to have as your overarching policy for mistakes or administrative sanctions that involve listing information. The second part of this deals with the accountability of a principal broker, the participant, for the licensees affiliated with them. And this note and the accompanying policy statement indicate that when you do have a affiliated licensee, a subscriber, who violates more than 3 administrative sanctions in a calendar year, that if that does subsequently then go to a hearing, that they've lost their right to pay an administrative sanction, that the principal broker, the participant, would have to accompany that individual to the hearing because they should be more involved in the accountability and understanding what that individual is doing that are potential violations of the Code of Ethics. So not only the MLS will impose sanctions to address it, but that the principal broker, the participant, can take steps within their office to try and address it as well.
Thank you, Rodney. 2 questions on this. A couple folks asked what constitutes or what defines what's defined as an administrative sanction. You're muted.
Yep, look at that. I muted myself. So administrative sanctions are, it doesn't go to a hearing. This is which numerous MLSs, I believe, adopt as their governance standpoint for potential violations of their rules, is that either staff or a group looks at a potential action of somebody and they issue a sanction. There's no full due process hearing. There's no requesting information from the potential violator. That the MLS would simply look at the actions and be able to make a determination. And they can do that. The recipient of that sanction has a right to challenge that or disagree with that sanction. And if they do, they can request a hearing, at which case then it gets into the full due process elements of a hearing with a complainant, opportunity to go before your peers to be judged, opportunity for an appeal, and so on and so forth. But an administrative sanction is more of a traffic ticket violation where you pay to get out of it, but related to MLS rules and regulations.
Great. Thank you, Rodney. A couple questions about the number of, so here it says 3 administrative sanctions. A couple questions as to whether or not that can be modified at local discretion. So one question was, can we make it 2? Another, can we, is 3 set in stone or can that be modified?
So I would say that you couldn't go more than 3, that the national policy is 3, but if you wanted to tighten that up to something more, or you have your own deterrent for participants and subscribers violating your rules and regulations that differs from this, that you can continue to do that. But at a minimum, every MLS would have to follow this mandate as far as no more than 3 administrative sanctions within a calendar year.
Great. Thank you, Rodney. Okay, gonna move on to the next section here. Okay, next section. Again, the underlined text is the addition to the existing model rule. So this is under section 9, consideration of alleged violations. And the addition here of the model rule is to create a process or to allow and enable a process locally where an MLS can receive and process complaints anonymously. So if I'm a broker or an agent in your marketplace in your MLS, I should be able to report an issue with the listing, have you process it, and take enforcement action if it comes to that against a listing broker or participant or subscriber without you having to tell them who reported them. So that's the text here, and then we'll see it again when we cover the policy side of it. Rodney, can you give us the background here and why there was a need for this rule and policy when we get there?
Certainly. Thanks, Renee. So this is another one from the MLS standards work group. Again, getting to the heart of complete and accurate information. And one of the ways to do that is enforcement of local rules and regulations. Number of MLSs already have adopted processes where you can have concerns or actions of potential violations brought to the attention of the MLS without disclosure of the complainant. This creates a national standard requirement for that. This is to eliminate the stigma of bringing complaints against fellow participants that violate the rules and regulations. And where you talk about the not disclosing the name and the identity of the complainant, it's for the administrative portion of it. If this does get forwarded for a hearing and the complainant, the individual who brought it to the attention of the MLS, is unwilling to disclose their name or unwilling to participate in the process, that there is now an opportunity for representatives of the MLS to serve as the complainant. For those of you who are familiar with professional standards, there's something very similar on the professional standard side for ethics violations, where a complainant who takes themselves out of the process, the complaint would go back to the grievance committee, and the grievance committee would take the position, a representative of the grievance committee would take the position as the complainant to carry that complaint forward. Here's the same thing. So eliminating the stigma, creating greater opportunities for bringing concerns to the attention of the MLS where there are issues related to rules enforcement, with the overarching understanding that all of that will help in creating more accurate and more complete information for the multiple listing service.
Thank you, Rodney. And Kathy, hi, Kathy. Kathy points out that many MLSs, many organizations already allow subscribers to report anonymously through their listing platform. So there's a follow-up question to that, a related question to that. Marissa asks, what if the MLS needs more information? We handle all reports anonymously, as in we don't disclose who reported the issue, but we know in case we need to gather additional information. And the policy, and both the policy and the rule contemplate that, right? It's not a prohibition on the MLS knowing who reported the issue. And in fact, you should, right? And as Marissa points out, it's likely that you may need to follow up and gather additional information if the initial report wasn't complete. But rather, this is asked to whether or not the listing broker should be told, can I, as the MLS, can I go to Rodney, listing broker, and say, hey, Rodney, Charlie Lee reported you on this particular issue? It's addressing that and not the MLS's ability to know and be able to process those complaints. Rodney Lance asks if on Section 9, why does this differ from the Code of Ethics violation, from a Code of Ethics violation where we can't have anonymous reports?
And we throw around the term anonymous here. There is still an opportunity, like I pointed out on the professional standards side, for the grievance committee to take the position for the complainant if it goes to a hearing. If you're talking about bringing something forward without having to disclose the name of who brought it forward, there is a citation policy on the professional standards side. And that citation policy does include the option to not disclose the name of the complainant during that citation process. So similar here on the administrative sanction side, there's that opportunity to keep the name out of it. And there's the same thing on the citation policy. But you got to look for the citation policy on NAR.Realtor, and you would have to adopt a procedure which would withhold the name of the complainant during that process.
Great, thank you. Charlie?
Yeah, and I was just going to point out that, the dynamic is also a little different with the MLS enforcing and ensuring that its policies are being enforced and followed properly versus kind of the Code of Ethics there. Here, the MLS, is looking at just kind of the MLS system overall, looking out for all the participants. And so I think that, you want to make sure that if there are any issues or situations where the policies are not being followed, that you get as much of that information so that they can consider it and they can pursue it, kind of, akin to like, the state's attorney or the attorney general in your state, where, if a crime is committed, then they can act on behalf of the state and follow up and look into that charge, and then potentially even file something against the individual who has committed something. So yeah, I think the dynamic is a little different there.
Great, thank you, Charlie. All right, I see a lot of great questions coming in. Go ahead and please continue sending those in. We'll circle back and get to those. Want to make sure that we touch on all the changes here and provide plenty of time for that questions as well a little later. Okay, so those were the changes to the model MLS rules. Now we'll be covering changes to MLS policy statements. The first one is a change or an update to policy statement 7.90. So this is an existing policy. We've added the text that's underlined at the bottom of the paragraph here. And this is dealing with our policy on real estate transaction standards and RESO standards now. So the addition here is that web API data access be provided to participants and subscribers and must have no less than the same data available via data access methods such as RETs or FTP systems, and MLS fields that exist in the RESO data dictionary must be delivered in conformance with the standard. So as you'll recall, this policy statement has been around for a while. In fact, it required adoption of RESO standards data dictionary back in January 2016, and the RESO web API by June 30th, 2016. And there's a requirement that you maintain those current. RESO typically has yearly updates for certification that are required that have to be implemented. And you can get additional information on those by going to reso.org. Rodney, this was about providing and ensuring that the same data sets are available. And it's okay if there's a RETs feed currently, right? But the web API must be provided and contain the same information that a participant's be able to access via whatever other method that they're currently accessing. Is that right?
Correct. And like you pointed out, the policy was amended back in 2014 with the different deadlines for adopting certain RESO standards. It's a slow turn in the industry for us when we talk about switching from existing platforms and distribution of information to where everybody agrees we should be going. One of the concerns here was that while MLSs may be complying with the policy and the different deadlines for data dictionary and in particular web API, that there was a disincentive in some MLSs because the web API data feed included substantially less information than other data feeds provided by the multiple listing service, RETs being one, FTP possibly another one. So what this does is level the playing field so that brokers, vendors, others can ensure that they have the most complete data set, not only from the other data feeds, but also from the preferred RESO web API data feed and access. So this will hopefully push us in that direction.
Thank you, Rodney. There's a follow-up question. We touched on this a little bit earlier. There's a question as to the difference between MLS policies and model MLS rules. So for MLS administrators on the call today, is this something that needs to be adopted? And the question was, I can't determine if this is supposed to be in our MLS rules and regulations or not. Can you just very briefly touch on the difference or where this would be adopted as this is a MLS policy statement, not a model MLS rule?
Yes, definitely. So everything we covered to this point were changes to the model rules. Those are rules that your subscribers and participants have to abide by. And if they don't, they can be sanctioned for violating that. There are also certain elements in there that the MLS needs to do. When it comes to the policy statements, it's everything about what the MLS needs to do. And this is a perfect example of that. This isn't something that the participant's going to be sanctioned for, or something that you would need to incorporate into your rules and regulations governing your brokers and your agents. This is something that the MLS needs to comply with. So for the MLS policy statements, you'll see an overlap in what's in the rules because it's the foundational element of where those rules stem from. But you'll see other aspects of policy that delve more into what the MLS needs to be doing. And this is an example of that, in that the MLS needs to be providing data feeds that provide the same type of access and information, not only through different delivery mechanisms apart from RESO, but also in RESO.
Great, thank you for that, Rodney. Okay, let's go on to the next section here. All right, this is a new policy statement, policy statement 8.2 related to customer service and tech support. I think this one's pretty straightforward. The MLS must display customer service and technical support contact information on the MLS website. Again, this is a mandatory policy. This isn't a rule that you would adopt and enforce this to anyone. This is a directive towards the MLS. Very simply put, include and make available customer service and technical support contact information. there's definitely a need for your participants and data consumers to identify who to reach out to on the MLS side. More importantly, if a participant's locked out or having an issue and they can't get into your MLS platform to look up the phone number they should be calling, similarly, this would give them an avenue to go to your website, look up the information, and reach out. We've said it on previous webinars. Rodney and I oftentimes will go to a website for an MLS and try to reach someone, and even us will find a lack of contact information. So this is simply, you comply with this by putting up your contact information. Rodney?
And it's not just a self-serving policy for Renee, Charlie, and myself. There are real use case examples where vendors or participants have challenges in learning about different data feeds, different questions related to services. So while it seems somewhat, elementary, there are real examples out there, guys, where MLSs aren't providing this information. So a policy indicating such was needed.
And I'll say that even for just, government bodies, in working with Arello, I will hear, from different licensing boards, and they'll say that sometimes they have trouble knowing who exactly they're supposed to contact with the MLS because this information just isn't available or they couldn't find it. So I think it just makes a lot of sense, and it just goes beyond even the things that we can think about.
And thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Rodney. Rodney, there's two questions here on this one. Do we mean inside the MLS screen? So I would imagine they're talking about the MLS platform, or does this contact information need to be on the website?
I would say it'd be both.
Okay. And the second one is the contact information for MLS staff or their MLS vendor? So who should the MLS or association be putting up their own contact information, or should this information be for the MLS vendor, the platform provider?
It seems to me if you want to be safe, you'd probably put it all up there, but it all depends on what the inquiry is going to be, right? So if it's questions about the platform, then yeah, your vendor might be able to answer those. But if it's questions more about services and other things that the MLS is involved in, you should provide that information.
And this also comes down to, for technical support, right? This may come down to your agreements with your vendors, who's providing, tier 1 support or line, the first line of support. If that's your vendor, then that's maybe one avenue. Things like data licensing, IDX requests, I would imagine those are going to use. So you would want that contact information. So it should be as to the most appropriate person, but as Rodney says, you can't go wrong by having your direct association or MLS contact information along with any technical support. Okay. Next, new policy statement, statement 8.1, on fair housing. This is a brand new statement, so it's not underlined, but this is a brand new section. Multiple listing services are important tools for furthering fair housing because they facilitate the widespread distribution of accurate property information to all consumers. To that end, MLSs must implement a process for identifying potential violations of fair housing laws, advising participants and subscribers to remove or correct potential violations. Rodney, can you give us the background on this one?
And this one stems from the environment that we're in, right? And the challenges that we have as an industry when you talk about DE&I, and fair housing. So a lot of MLSs already, we've heard, adopted different processes to help identify issues related to fair housing. This just makes it a mandatory consideration of MLSs to establish a process. And the question we typically hear here is, well, what does that process look like? There's a lot of flexibility in how the MLS implements its process. There's different software out there that can help identify keywords that may be at issue. You might want to try an audit process where the MLS will occasionally go in and look for potential problems. Whatever you're doing, what we were told from our content experts at NAR is you're going to want to have some type of human interaction, because a word list will take you so far. You need to have somebody else to look at that and determine if there is a real potential issue there or not. And again, we're bringing this to the attention of the participants and the subscribers so that they can correct or remove potential violations. There's no obligation here for the MLS to take action to do so. Some MLSs are comfortable in doing that. And if you are, that's your determination. This does not create an obligation to do that.
Great, thank you. Charlie, anything to add here?
Yeah, I'll just add to what Rodney is saying in that, you know, I think what's envisioned here is for there to be a process so that the participant or subscriber can be alerted about potential violations. And so we're not looking, you know, for the MLS to necessarily, you know, take an active role per se in correcting, you know, the potential issues with fair housing. But I think it's to have a system so that if there is something that the participant subscriber can know about it, and then they can know how to properly handle it. And then in terms of, you know, just, you know, well, what is it? You know, how am I supposed to handle it? I think with MLS, that you can definitely provide education, you know, as to, you know, what are, you know, certain terms or descriptions that can raise issues that may not be the intent when those terms are being used, and so that they can consider, you know, suitable alternatives in describing the property or the information that they put into the property listing information.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, let's move forward here. Okay, a lot going on with this one. It's easier to read on the summary document that I sent via the chat. I'll send it once more in just a second here for any of you that may have joined after I originally sent it. But Rodney, we updated our MLS logo and the usage permissions behind that. Can you walk us through how someone can, or the intent behind the changes and how someone obtains permission to use the MLS logo now?
Caught myself in a mute again. Like you said, there's a lot going on this one. For purposes of time, I don't think we have to go through every aspect of this, but everyone should be aware of the fact that this all stems from NAR creating a new MLS logo, a new modernized logo, one that complies with ADA. And in that process, we looked at the way MLSs and participants and subscribers received access to use that logo. And we saw this as a great opportunity to streamline that. So you no longer have to send in duplicate copies of a license agreement for them to be executed by NAR and us to send something back to you, that we've determined the agreement that you sign as realtor associations for use of NAR's trademarks is covering the use of the new NAR MLS logo. So no more agreements you have to send to us when you change your name, when you change your jurisdiction, when you become an association of realtors, you sign the appropriate license agreement that will cover the use of NAR's new MLS logo. You'll find that logo on nar.realtor. Highly encourage all of you to take it. It's a new opportunity to use that, showcase that you're a realtor association, multiple listing service, and encourage your participants, your brokers, your agents to do the same. That we should promote the benefits of joining the MLS, using the MLS, and what that means for the public. So all of these changes here reflect that, Renee, along with the other changes to the following sections, explaining who has use and access of the information. Any MLS that has its governing documents approved or certified to NAR as being in compliance has a right to use the logo, as does the Association of Realtors that owns and operates that MLS, as does any realtor who participates or subscribes with that multiple listing service.
Thank you for that, Rodney. And this is informational. It's not mandatory adoption. And there was a question that came in. Do we have to use the standard MLS logo of NAR? So similarly, there's no mandate or requirement that you use our logo. If you may have your own local MLS logo, but if you do want to use ours, so you may have something branded to your MLS or your association. If you do use the NAR logo, this would cover that.
And the only caveat I'd throw into that, Renee, is that you can't take the trademarks. You can't take the block R, you can't take the trademarks and incorporate them into your MLS logo. The other thing with the new NAR MLS logo is you can't use it on jewelry, guys. I'm sorry, you're gonna have to tell your members they can't incorporate it into jewelry. I don't know why there's a specific carve out. We've had it in the past and it carried over into this. If you want any use like that, I would advise you to contact our legal affairs department. Chloe Height can help you with regard to that. I'd also ask, because she has asked us, if anybody is already using the new NAR MLS logo, please let us know. Put it in the chat. We'd love to hear from you, or the Q&A, because we're going to use that as we register for trademark protection with regard to the new logo, and we need real life examples of its use. So please let us know. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rodney. And several of you are asking to see the new logo. I've put the link into the chat box. Let me get through the slides here, and then I'll come back and exit the slide deck, and I'll display that on the screen here. But for now, I have the link in the chat. You can click on that, and you'll have access to a couple variations of the updated logo. Okay. Next section. This is a change to existing MLS policy statement 7.60. And it's maintaining accurate listing data is a critical necessity for achieving the defined purpose of the MLS. Participants and subscribers are required to submit accurate listing data and be required to correct any known errors. So this is the companion to the model MLS rule that we touched on earlier. This is the corresponding MLS policy statement edition. So this is an existing policy statement. So your modification would be just the inclusion of the underlying text.
But they wouldn't have to adopt this, Renee. So this is, again, a foundational policy. The rule, the model rule, is what we have in the first part of the summary that should be incorporated into local rules and regulations.
Thank you. Okay. This is a new policy statement, statement 8.3. Right of participants to MLS data feed of listing content. Now it seems, this one seems like we talked about it long ago, but this is the participant data access policy where, and I think we've addressed it on previous webinars, where a participant is entitled to receive their own data back through a data feed. So any information, listing information that they submitted to the service, you're required to deliver that, as in MLS, you're required to deliver that back to the participant through a RESO standardized data feed. So this is the policy statement that went into effect. Many of you commented previously that you already provide this as a service at your MLS. For those of you that hadn't previously provided that, this new policy statement requires you to make that available to participants. I want to spend a little bit of time here on the designee part, because we received a lot of questions on the policy statement here provides for a participant to request their data be provided to them or their designee. Rodney and Charlie, are there any limitations as to who that designee can be or how many designees there can be?
So there is no limitation on who the designee is or how many designees there are. As pointed out in the first paragraph, if there are costs involved in the MLS providing that information, that those delivery charges can be assessed back to the participant. But there is no limitation on the use or who the designee is.
And Charlie, there's some questions about the MLS's relationship with that designee, with that third party. So they're not a participant. Can the MLS require that designee to enter into a data license agreement that would address things like timely access, identification of that designee? Is that something that the MLS can do, provided that they don't limit who a designee is?
Yes, yeah, I think that makes sense. And, you may want to incorporate, any sort of safeguards to prevent that access from, posing any sort of risks to anybody, anything else outside of that data feed or the participants' information in the MLS. I think so that would be reasonable. It's just more in terms of where you are now using a data access agreement to try to somehow limit what the designee receives pursuant to this policy. And so, that's where then you are undermining the policy, and you want to avoid any sort of unnecessary burdens that the designee would have to absorb in order to get this access.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. There are a couple of questions about, what if you're in a non-disclosure state? Can you provide sold data? And again, keep in mind that this is as to a participant's own information that they've submitted to the service. We won't get into the IDX aspects of it, but yes, any information that the participant submitted to the service should be provided back to them, even in non-disclosure state. So typically, non-disclosure, what you may be referring to is the IDX provision as to whether or not you include sold information where it's if you're in a state where it's not publicly accessible or available. This is different. This is a different policy. This is as to a participant's own data. Okay, and a couple more questions. We'll circle back to those. Okay.
Hey, so, Renee, can I?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just say something a little bit more about that policy, the data access policy? And I just want to just say that, I've heard comments from different MLSs and associations where they will express concern that the participants maybe don't realize who they're giving the access to. And so they try to, install certain measures to, I guess, kind of protect, their members, their participant subscribers in being exploited by giving away this type of access. And my response to that is that, then I think the MLS and association are able to provide information, education, enable them to be able to make, wise decisions, informed decisions, and work with them. But you cannot control who they give it to and limit who they give, their data access to, because that would be inconsistent with the policy.
That's perfect. Thank you, Charlie. Okay, the last section that we had on the slide here, and I exited the slide deck, and I want to point you over to the link that I sent for the summary. So the remaining section, 7.21, talks about appropriate procedures for rule enforcement. So this is that corresponding change to policy statement that enables the processing of anonymous complaints, and along with some additional changes related to that and administrative sanctions. But I want to focus on, if you access the summary document on your end, and that one's a couple pages long, so I couldn't fit it all on the slides, but there's a section that's informational only. It's the categories of violations and how you can classify those. It's provided as a resource that's not a mandatory adoption. So if you currently have classifications for your rule violations and the progressive discipline behind that, you don't need to change that. It's strictly provided as a resource so that if you don't have categories for your violations as addressed in that policy statement 7.91, you can use that as a resource. So we have a couple minutes left. We have about 6 minutes or so. Want to go back and answer any questions that we may have skipped. There's a couple of them, so we want to get to those. Rodney, if you see one or two that you want to pick off, and then
no, before we get into the questions, and you may have covered in the beginning, forgive me if you did. I saw in the question somebody asked about the review process for MLS, and we're switching over to a self-certification process similar to the compliance process for association bylaws. That will be launched likely in the next week or so. So keep an eye out for it. You'll no longer have to send in your governing documents to NAR and await a letter or correspondence from us explaining the areas that need to be changed. You'll simply certify to the National Association that you've adopted the mandatory areas, and we'll have a list of those for your consideration when you do make that certification. So keep an eye out for that.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Rodney. And I just want to display the logo here that we referenced, so a couple variations on the logo as well. So I'll leave that up for a second while we go through some of the questions here.
So we have one here from Donna Roach. Thank you, Donna. Our member alerted me to a listing that may have possible fair housing violations. Is it okay? Or does the MLS staff have to go through looking for the listing?
I can touch on that, Rodney.
Go ahead.
Yep, I was just going to say that the way that the policy is intended is that you can have it so that it is the MLS is alerted about an issue, and then the participant or subscriber is then informed and given the opportunity to be able to address the issue. I don't think the MLS is look through all the listings to identify those violations, because as we said, some of these things are things that it's just kind of case dependent. And so the consumer may have an issue with a particular description about the listing. And so we just want to ensure that MLSs provide a process where the broker or the agent is given the opportunity to be able to resolve that and to handle it the way that they deem to be best.
Renee, we have another one here. Will there be a hard and fast cutoff date for all data to be delivered via Web API, and RETs must be sundowned?
So great question. And that's a great discussion that's been occurring in the MLS industry, the associations in conjunction with RISO. As you know, there's been a policy in place that requires adoption and implementation of Web API, and along with the data dictionary, and MLSs have to certify behind that. And so that should be in place already. Will there be a sunsetting of RETs? We put that back to you. There's certainly still use case scenarios for bulk delivery of data and access that RETs provides. API can provide, that similar type of delivery. So that's a discussion I think that can best happen over with RISO and the tech folks on whether or not that should be sunsetted. Under our policies, MLSs are required to adopt Web API RISO standards under our RISO policy, and along with any yearly changes that occur.
And for the ones who don't, that would jeopardize their errors and omissions insurance policy if they don't provide a Web API option for receiving the information. And further, if they don't comply with any mandatory policy of the National Association, that there's a chance of loss of errors and omissions insurance coverage.
Thank you, Rodney. There's another question here about adoption of rules. If my association owns and operates their MLS, but we use a vendor to service our MLS, which does so for a group of other associations, is my board required to adopt the MLS policy statements, or is this something that will be included in the vendor's policies? So these should be, the model rules should be in your local MLS documents. So your rules and regulations. You wouldn't want to rely on an MLS vendor adopting rules because your participants are subject to your local MLS rules, not the vendors. So you should have these in your own documents, rules and regulations that you publish to membership, and not point to receipt over to a third party or a vendor for those.
And I'd add that you shouldn't rely on your vendor to be complying with NAR policy, that each MLS may contract with a vendor to provide that service, but you operate the multiple listing service, and your associations and your MLSs need to ensure that you're operating in a manner that's consistent with MLS policy. When's the recording going to be available? We got that one too, Renee.
Yeah, hopefully by beginning of next week, we'll get it edited and uploaded onto our website, and we'll get that published on, if you go to nar.realtor and search for MLS Hour, you'll find a link to the recording by early portion of next week.
Lola's asking for a link. We did put a link to the summary, didn't we?
Yes, I'll
Lola, there's a link to the summary. Also, if you go to nar.realtor and you simply do a search on the 2021 MLS handbook, you'll get the handbook, which includes everything that you need.
Okay, so we're a minute over time, but let's see if there are any final questions here that we can cover before we conclude this session here.
All right.
So going back to the sanctions section, I think I saw this question 2 or 3 times. There's a reference to sanctions issued in a calendar year. And there's a question as to why a calendar year, and a separate question where is this a calendar year as we define it traditionally, or a calendar year from the date of the first sanction?
And what the group decided was that it was a calendar year. And the reason they decided that was that they thought it was simpler for implementation. Otherwise, MLSs would have to keep track and manage when somebody violated something and count a year from that date and so on and so forth. So for ease in implementation, the work group adopted that and instructed that it be a calendar year.
Great. Thank you, Rodney. So I think we addressed most of the other ones. There's a couple here remaining that we'll reach out to you directly and provide a response to you. But again, thank you everyone for hanging with us. We went a little bit over, about 2 minutes on our time, but great seeing you all in the chat list here. Look forward to seeing you on another webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you.